Karen, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. It's been exciting conversation. Sorry I had to step out for a few minutes at noon, but just I've been in several virtual meetings like Ellucian Live or Educause, and one of the things that has been very disappointing with this meetings was like there hasn't been much engagement. But I don't know what magic you're feeding them, but I've seen the chat traffic. There's a lot of engaged audience here. Kudos to you and your team for putting it together. Not only good panelists, with myself excluded, you have really good team that you know, and I think and a great audience. Thank you for inviting me.
I think, Karen, there's a couple things, and this is, like I said, between my Future X Tribe group that is really just building out what we will do in market in terms of this social element. There's a couple things. The reason we don't do webinars, and I'll stand on my soapbox for that. It's a one-way directional discussion. It's people selling me, and I say, I don't want to sit in timeshares. Why do I want to sit in a webinar? Like I can't, for me, I look at a webinar and it almost screeches to an end, because more often than not, I'm not getting the connection to the people that are actually speaking. And that I struggle with that. Now, sometimes some webinars will let you come in and it's canned and, oh, let me run the, like today, it's not about us. It's not, it's about your discussion in here. Because I think we're all learning, and we need to mentor, but we also need to be mentees. And I need to be a mentee as you talk, or as Lindsay talks, or as Ali talks, as importantly as Matt telling you what I think you should do in market. And if you look at the chatter, people are disagreeing with me. They're like, man, I disagree, which is exactly, and that's okay, because you have to think, maybe, okay, maybe I'm wrong. And I am. My wife will tell you that I'm wrong a lot of the time. So I think it's just a healthy conversation. I think having good conversations with people is really important. Yeah, but I think that the engagement comes from people feel like they're a part of the discussion. They're being talked with and not talked to. We're working with a couple conference, consortiums and things like that, where we're hoping that they will make the transition to things we're doing here, right?
Yeah.
And there's no reason why, using basic stuff, right? So.
Yeah, I can certainly attest to that. I think you're absolutely correct about, webinars being a poor form to present anything, because all you're doing is telling the audience what to do. I'll do a shameless plug here. I started a podcast called Illuminate Higher Education about 4 months ago. And I realized that, the new form of communicating or learning anything is really not just bits and bytes like a news channel or webinars make you believe, is really about having conversations. And I think it looks like you've instinctively found that. Obviously, I had to do it by my own experience. But you're absolutely correct. It's all about conversations. It's all about being interactive and being deliberate about what you want to do, which is listen and learn and hopefully evolve in the process.
Yeah, and Karen, the way that you will see us evolve, these conversations we're having will become podcasts. It will be on demand elements that people could then watch or listen and have these discussions that are two-way, that we could be challenged and disagree. Like Mark disagreed with me on one of my points. Like, let's have it. Like, that's what we should do. Because there's too many of, and right now higher ed's in the situation that they're in, because they haven't had people outside of the table that they all commonly sit in, because they're all talking the same thing, because they all look the same, feel the same, they've been through the same experiences. They haven't actually had outsiders come in and shake it up a little bit. And I think that's as important for the transformation we're going to make. Yeah, it's an interesting time.
Well, we are outsiders. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Right.
And
So I think,
you're a UIC alum, right? Because I'm a UIC alum.
yeah, I went to school there, but I did my master's there in Chicago, I love the second city.
Nice, nice.
I'd like the shout out to Chicago here.
Are you from Chicago?
Yeah, I went to Northwestern.
Oh, cool.
Nice. Welcome.
I
Welcome.
grew up in
Where
Chicago.
do you live in Chicago?
I live currently in Chicagoland, Des Plaines.
Oh, Des Plaines. Yeah,
Cool.
my wife went to Maine East. So,
Yeah,
How's-
Northwestern is a great school. Like that's my son is a junior in high school, and that's his number one because his and we're excited for sure.
Yeah, lots of
I
exciting.
love I have great feelings
you're
of
breaking
Chicago
up.
here.
You're breaking
All
up.
right,
Is that him or is that me? Not positive.
It's Kieran.
see,
So nice. How do you say your name? Is it Ishrat?
Ishrat.
I think it should be okay now.
Nice meeting you.
You too, yeah. Clubhouse is something interesting I've recently got on. And so it's kind of fascinating just going back to the whole webinar and meeting experience. Like I see you and I'm following you, and then here you are in a meeting and I'm joining and I'm like, this is kind of interesting. It's like that whole 360.
We're gonna blend Clubhouse and Zoom and whatever other platforms people are, yesterday was a big discussion. Will Clubhouse, sustain? Like the reality is it doesn't matter. It's the concepts of what Clubhouse is doing. We're kind of doing Clubhouse for video if you think about it, right? That's what we're really doing. The only difference is Clubhouse is very organic discussions. Things pop up on a daily basis. Whereas these things have to be planned a little bit. Even though I am doing a Zoom in next week on careers in higher ed impacted by the pandemic. So if you guys want to do our Zoom in next week, join us again, and it'll be fun. So, Mark, we got a minute, and I'm going to let you drive this discussion because I haven't got my cup of coffee yet, and so I'm going to go do that while you and Carrie and Karen kick off the next piece. I'm gonna
Sounds good.
I'm gonna set up the Quiller for you guys. Is everyone having access? Any issues on the side with the chat or the Quiller or anything like that? If so, just let us know. The Quiller, we eventually will have a landing page that has all these Quillers on there. So you can always come back and look at each one of them at any point in time. We will update each segment into each Quiller so you can revisit it just like Steve's talked about the previous one. But yeah, this is an organic discussion. We're excited. We're now moving into our next track. Mark, I'm going to let you go. And I believe JTH and others will be joining us shortly. They're on some client stuff, but we'll move forward.
Okay, excellent. So I see Carrie's on, Kiran's on. So let's jump right into it. So let's level set a little bit. I've known Carrie for a while. I've known Kiran for a little bit, but just to cut to the chase, Carrie, you've worked on multiple dimensions of integration architecture, both as an enterprise application provider, where we work together, and now in the preeminent standards organization for the education sector. Kiran, you've built an integration platform that's now used by hundreds of education customers. They stitch together all the applications. And one of the challenges there, I think everyone's aware of, is some of those applications are literally decades old. So I'd like, if you could, to kick this off with you guys describing the difference between integration and interoperability, and both the concept and examples of the practice, if you can. And I'll let you guys have a dialogue on that.
Sure, I'll let Carrie go first, and then I'll jump in as needed.
Sure. What's interesting, of course, is that there is absolutely zero consensus on those terms. If you go out and do a Google search or whatever. Interestingly, also, just side note, a lot of the conversation seems to be around healthcare and the healthcare industry use of integration and interoperability. But yeah, if you go out and you look at sort of the definitions of what Merriam-Webster's definition of interoperability is, you get distinctly antithetical definitions, and you get definitions that to me don't make a particular lot of sense. That integration specifically makes use of middleware, whereas interoperability doesn't. For me, Yeah, I don't get that. For me, it's kind of that Supreme Court ruling of I'll know it when I see it, although we're talking about a very different subject here. In that integration when I think about integration, I think about the technical exchange of information and data between two or more systems and the infrastructure that entails, technology, et cetera. Whereas interoperability, I tend to think of as the leveraging of integration, among other things, to solve business problems and business requirements across multiple solutions. Interoperability is the systems working together to solve the problem. Integration is the exchange of data that facilitates that. That's my definition, but I'd be curious as to Kiran's.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right on point that there is no uniform standard or definition, if you will. But I think if you want to just take a step back and look at some other integrations or interoperabilities, the best thing you can think about it is an electricity, right? So think of data as electricity. We are pumping the data from the grid to our outlets. So what makes a toaster oven or a fridge or a TV or a computer all work using the same outlet, right? So that I consider that as an interoperability where you have a plug that you can plug into that can all work with any system. So that's kind of the interoperability layer. And the interoperability layer in this example is really that standard voltage and wattage that electricity provides. Integration is more about how the data gets from the source to the destination. In the example of electricity, it's really the grid creates electricity and pumps it to each houses through the transmission layer, which is whatever we call it, power grid is the right analogy. So that's kind of the high level, at least I think about. I think they are mutually distinct terms for sure. And I think as we dig deeper, we'll probably understand more. But ultimately, integration is taking data or water or electricity from source to a destination. Interoperability is making sure that the same pipe or plug we use to move data, electricity or water from one system to another can be used for another system or destination as well.
Okay.
Mark, did that help?
Yeah, it did. And I like that because that's a good transition to my next question. And analogies always help, but so I'll throw this one at Carrie. So all the appliances we use, as you mentioned, they're standards. You've got to build to, so when you plug it in, it actually works. And I still run into a lot of people, particularly in this industry and focus on ed tech, who kind of believe standards restrict innovation, at least restrict the pace of innovation, and they seem to almost equate them with regulations. And so I wanted to see how you would counter that, particularly if you think about a full application life cycle of all the different parts of the campus topography. And I'd also welcome some comments in the chat while Carrie answers that if we get some other perspectives on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that you do hear resistance to the adoption of standards that in some fashion they inhibit innovation or slow down innovation. And potentially, can you, for example, build faster if you're building completely on your own? Sure. But that's a short-term gain that I believe ultimately doesn't really look at the long-term picture of that. So one of the things that standards can do is they enable innovation across the ecosystem, and suppliers, and like you said, you and I came from a supplier background, worked together for many years. Suppliers have to think about not only their own product and what their product is providing, but how that product fits into that larger ecosystem on campus. And that's a place where the development of standards and the implementation of standards facilitates innovation, precisely because, to Karen's analogy, because you're not having to rebuild the plumbing every time. Every time you build a house, somebody's not having to reinvent plumbing or reinvent the diameter of pipes in the house or anything like that. So by creating and implementing those standards, we actually allow for a focus on functional innovation, on technical innovation, and get away from having to think about that plumbing on a regular basis. It gets away from kind of just how do I get the data to what can I do with the data. And you're not, like I said, you're not having to rebuild that or even think about that much at every time. So I would say, when you think about, for example, well, at an individual product level, even if I'm building an integration, I'm building a point-to-point integration, or I'm using proprietary APIs, that's great. That may be the fastest way for me to get something out there. But then think about the fact that every consumer of that API has to build to that API. And that's, you start to slow down the larger ecosystem there. So, again, you got to look at the big picture and think about the big picture and what that means.
Yeah, no, I think particularly with the increasing constraints on a lot of institutions' IT budget, the ability and the ethos of doing a lot of custom or one-off effort is it just isn't part of it. Shouldn't at least be part of the culture moving forward. So we flip to the other side, Karen. You provide an integration, what I would consider strategic integration architecture in your platform solution. Which is great. It helps you solve some of those problems. But let's flash forward and assume vendors start building to standard APIs. They conform to the standards. At that point, why would anybody need an integration platform solution? Where does the strategic value go?
Right. I think so. Stepping back about the Carrie's question, the question to query about why there's two parts to integration, right? One is why are vendors or suppliers not building to spec is a bigger question to be had, because Carrie is absolutely correct. It's very tactical decision they're making. But if you think about where we are as a ecosystem, we have 6 to 8 big student information systems, and each student information system, let's assume that they will all agree on a standard and start sharing data in a standard format, right? Whether it's Banner, Ellucian, which is Ethos, and campus management has their own integration standard. Right now, the way the ecosystem is built is Ethos has their own specification, campus management has their own specification, even though it's built on a good standard with Microsoft. Microsoft and Workday has their own API specification. But that is just one part of the puzzle, right? We have identified that each of the vendor, which is student information system, is now agreed to share data in a similar format, which is a huge feat in itself. But let's assume that that does happen. And if that happens, you still need this other SaaS, hundreds, if not thousands of SaaS vendors, whether it's your Salesforces of the world or Recruitment RX or Enrollment RX or Parchment. They all have to also fit to that standard and make sure that they can receive the data and send the data in that format. So that's the other part of it, right? Once the key authoritative source of information, student information systems, share the data, the recipients of information should also comply. And let's assume that that magically happens as well. But just because the source is well defined and the destination can accept it, it doesn't plug in automatically. There still needs to be a wire that connects a source with a destination. That is typically called a middleware or an integration platform as a service. As impossible as it might sound, even if that happens, there's still going to be a need for either an institution providing purchasing a middleware and integrating a source with a destination, or a student information system or an ERP system itself is providing it. So the best example of this is Workday. Workday actually provides a fully available specifications, which is, hundreds of APIs, if not thousands of them. They've also exposed their business processes as APIs. But in addition to all of this, they actually provide a full integration bus along with it. So that is the only way a institution or a main authoritative source can truly provide integration, which is A, provide standardized APIs, B, expose their business processes as consumable APIs, and C, provide a middleware to allow them to integrate from point A to point B. I hope that helps.
If I can real quickly just jump on a really important point that I think Karen touched on, and that is one of the values of middleware that is really easy to forget about. And I think iPaaS solutions is an area where, an emerging area where it's really, really exciting because of this is, more and more we have to get out of the mindset that integration or interoperability is between two systems. Ultimately, it's a web of architecture that exists. And so you may be connecting, for example, from your SIS, you may be feeding out to an iPaaS solution to end. What you do with it from there becomes infinitely more flexible and meaningful, precisely because it's not, even if it's standards-based, it's not a point-to-point based integration. You can do all sorts of enrichment and hydration of the data and orchestration of the processes within that middleware piece when you stop thinking about integration as being from point A to point B, but it's really that web of the ecosystem that exists.
Okay. I like the, I'm not 100% sure what it means, but I like the idea of hydrating the data.
I stole that from somebody else. I don't remember who.
Someone stated, being self-serving, that an intentional integration architecture that complies or adheres to industry standards as part of the operating model of the institution becomes a strategic asset. And so I'd like to connect that if you guys can, because you do work with so many different types of institutions and vendors. Can you basically describe some examples or use cases where that applies, and in a business context of cost and risk and opportunity, risk mitigated and opportunity realized.
Yeah, I'll use a really quick example where that's came very much to the fore. So obviously, the events of the past year, especially about a year ago now, when there was a very sudden and very massive unexpected shift in the delivery of learning and how institutions needed to think about delivering learning to their students. That essentially took the form of a 100% shift or close to it to online learning, to online delivery of learning via learning platforms, via digital content and new tools like Zoom, for example, entering the higher education space in a meaningful way. The use of LTI, Learning Tools Interoperability, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a standard out there from IMS that ties together learning platforms and learning tools and provides for seamless launch and a seamless user experience for students. And so it really kind of acts as the glue which holds the digital ecosystem, teaching and learning ecosystem together. That sudden massive shift, you had institutions, for example, I think University of Central Florida was one of them, that had a very, very robust LTI strategy in place. They'd heavily focused on the use of LTI in their overall ecosystem. They were able to take their entire institution, their entire student population online in 4 days, which is amazing. Yeah. And because they'd already adhered to and had a strategy around the use of standards. And we saw that in a lot of other places as well, whereas you saw a lot of institutions, and actually in more cases, even in K-12, that didn't have that strategic plan in place and had implemented it, where that transition was much more challenging.
Yeah, I can probably add a couple more use cases to that too. And I think the best use case I can come up with in addition to LTI is probably LDAP or Active Directory, right? So let's take the software ecosystem 20 years ago. Each software vendor was coming up with their own authentication and authorization schemes. They were allowing institutions to create their users, and it was exactly the same way as we manage student data right now, where they're saying, I don't want to work with somebody else. I'm going to create my own authentication, and they'll just create their users in my system. And there has been a confluence of, just like IMS Global, we have a confluence of bodies and consortia that got together and created the LDAP specification. And there was initial resistance to it. But once we got past the resistance, and now we have LDAP, Active Directory, and SAML, which is almost like if you don't work with these three systems, you're almost not going to be adopted. Institutions will not allow you to create a new login or new account in your system willy-nilly if you don't work with LDAP or Active Directory. So Mark, to answer your question, it is no longer it's not just about strategic asset. You essentially will go out of business if you don't comply standards. And I think some of the work that we are currently doing with IMS Global, with Edu API, and I'll let Carrie talk about that, is kind of getting to that level where we're saying, this should be the standard specification for how we interchange, not just authentication and authorization data, but also student data and learning data. So absolutely, it is a strategic asset. Otherwise, you'll become a dinosaur.
Hey, really quick, just because a lot of the stuff you're talking is very technical. So I want to just bring it out for the audience, and we can go back into technical so they understand. But like what you're doing, Carrie, at IMS Global is you're really decentralizing the way that people interact, learners would interact with different institutions. And as we think about campuses and the learner itself, they're going to be in different places. They're going to have to interact differently. Industries are going to come in the future work. So I want to get people to understand the discussion here about this integration and all that really does impact the actual functional elements of what your organization will be supporting. So I just wanted to just make sure that I threw that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point of any standard should be ideally to facilitate facilitate the business, in this case, on campus. And that includes, how students interact with teaching and learning platforms and tools, how students interact with the administrative elements, and that translates into real world things like, for example, student mobility between campuses, what new ways of defining and understanding outcomes and assessments and credentialing and all of that stuff. Absolutely. It's easy to get too focused on the technical elements of it, but there's very much real world impacts here.
Yeah, I can give a couple of examples, Matt. I think you're absolutely correct. We should start looking at data integration not as a technical thing, but just like we're using the electricity analogy, electricity is worthless if you don't have a toaster or a fridge or a computer to plug into, right? So we built 5 years ago, we started building APIs called student APIs, which expose student data like registration data and billing data. So now the same API or web service is used by a student when they go to a mobile application to look up their bill, or it is also used by ACI on their student portal to be able to pull what the student owes to the institution so that ACI Worldwide can pay them. It's used by TouchNet to summarize their ID card data and expose it to them, and on and on. So the point is, when we build data integrations or APIs or web services, they're not just technical assets, they're actual assets a student interacts with. When a student goes to a portal to say, I want to talk to my advisor, they're talking through a web service. When an advisor grades a student, they're actually communicating through an API. But if we take it to the next level and build them in an interoperable and standardized way, then students can do more things. For example, the biggest use case is we're working with California Virtual Campus, where there's a state mandate that allows California to allow a student to be able to enroll in any online courses. So they're using web services that we created to register between campuses, browse courses between campuses, and also transfer financial aid, all by interacting with different student information systems and different learning management systems as well. So the use cases are very profound. We feel that some of the data integration can actually make education itself more affordable and accessible, and it's been proven in some of the work we're doing with California.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, changing the lens around a bit to talk about what's coming in the future. I mean, to some aspect of where we are today, and I think I know, having talked to a fair number of CIOs as they decided to move to the cloud, one of the first big things they had to grapple with was integration, their legacy applications, the history, the hundreds of them that had to be tracked down and understood. But I think taking your example, Kiran, this idea that a student, or some students at least, will be able to go out and enroll in classes and in real time or near real time pay a bill for those classes, but the classes potentially are being offered by multiple institutions that have signed a consortium agreement on the back end. So they're taking anthropology at this institute, and yet here's their curriculum and here is the bill. And that has to be resolved at the time they enroll. Even before we get to the online courses, that has to be resolved at the time they are enrolling. And when they pay the bill, the financial transactions have to be allocated to the right place, et cetera. My sense is that is somewhat inevitable. It's coming, and could, obviously could be disruptive, as much as I'm getting tired of that word. But what do you see? What do you see around integration strategy? Either one of you, or the folks on the call, that sort of either create or help negate these opportunities and risks for the application roadmaps going forward?
Well, it's already happening right now. I mean, in this limited ecosystem of 300 or so customers we have, two of our biggest consortia that we're working with is one of them is California Virtual Campus, which has a state mandate to allow a student to be able to enroll herself in any community college within the 123 college system. So when California Virtual Campus started working on this initiative, they realized that we have to deal with Banner and Colleague and Janzabar and Power Campus and campus management, and it was impossible for them to negotiate how to make all these systems work. So that's when End2End got involved. We deployed our APIs in about 45 school districts now, which is about at least 90 institutions. So once Illuminate is deployed and we deploy our APIs, student will be able to enroll at least 2 courses per semester in another institution in a real-time fashion. They'll be able to browse the catalog, they'll be able to register for a course, and they'll be able to pay their bill. And the only way they're able to do that is by deploying an system-wide integration strategy. Same thing with Florida Virtual Campus. Florida Virtual Campus had a system-wide strategy to allow a student to be able to click a button and register between one campus to another. So they also wanted to have an inter-institutional degree audit. So it is using behind the scenes the APIs that we created at End2End.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Kiran just said. The reality is not having a coherent integration strategy and not having the right solutions to implement that integration strategy, that's what creates risk these days. Integration, from a supplier standpoint, thinking of integration as some sort of value add-on, those days are over. They've been over for a long time, and it should have been acknowledged a long time ago. Integration is table stakes. Integration is basic functionality that has to be in place, and having a strategy in place and the role of standards in that strategy, it reduces risks for institutions. It reduces risk for suppliers, and it removes elements of kind of vendor lock-in and things like that that just create that capability for an institution working with their suppliers to focus on fulfilling the needs of, in this case, their students, and the requirements that they have, as opposed to having to think about the plumbing or having to think about the wiring.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this seems, this would appear to be the beginning stages of something that started, no offense intended, but as at a relatively mundane level, as we talked about plumbing. But nonetheless, before we realize it, are going to have potentially profound impacts on institutions, as for good and bad. I mean, this is I think really, as I said, a really profound development as it's starting to take place. I guess getting back to being a little more tactical, and you mentioned this a little bit already, Carrie, but COVID has had a big impact on the need to integrate, the realization that there are truly mountains of data and student telemetry to digest if we're going to replicate the outcomes we're looking for from in-person. And there's potentially a better way of understanding the student's mindset and in near real time. Having said that, I'm just wondering what, has COVID impacted your organizations or the roadmaps, or where you're focusing your efforts, and what can we see out of that over the next couple of years?
Yeah, certainly at IMS, we've seen that, for starters, we've had to be and have been responsive to things that have come up that we weren't necessarily on our roadmap, for example, as a community. Proctoring is a good example. All of a sudden proctoring, in-person proctoring went away. How do we deal with remote proctoring? There's a whole host of issues that we won't even begin to get into here with remote proctoring. But for example, we very quickly ran up a new LTI service working with the community around connecting platforms and proctoring services and tools to facilitate just that launch and initiation and the exchange of data necessary to undertake proctoring. Another great example is really what we've seen for the first time in many, many years of trying, for example, to get over the hump in learning analytics. We've been talking about learning analytics for 15 years probably, and we haven't really gotten the full buy-in in higher education around sort of the value proposition, partly because I think we were thinking about analytics at a very esoteric level, which is great and aspirational. But what we've seen all of a sudden is coming from CIOs and provosts and presidents is, again, with this massive reliance on the digital ecosystem, all of a sudden, this feeling that I don't have insight into what's really happening in those systems and the student interaction in those systems. So we've seen this sudden surge in interest in practical usage analytics related to learners and their engagement with the systems. So I think that's been we're seeing those kinds of sea changes in perspective.
Interesting. Steve, you had a comment you want to make? You're on mute there. There you go.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so going back to your question, Mark, about on a more tactical level, I completely agree with Carrie and Kieran, what they've been sharing, and a shout out to Carla Boyd for saying integration is power. Absolutely. So getting back to the tactical level, I remember having a discussion with a Gartner researcher back in 2010, 11 years ago. And what I was recommending to them, and they agreed, was I saw this need because I knew between what was going on in terms of the cloud, which most people didn't know what it was 11 years ago, and seeing the beginning of the world of SaaS, where now you have business leaders that could literally just sign a contract, the next thing you know, they're conducting business. I saw this need to create, on a more tactical level, what I would call an integration center of excellence. Now I'm taking, getting away from, Kieran and Carrie, they help organizations be successful with this. But ultimately, from the organization's perspective, creating an integration center of excellence now pulls in as someone else, chatted here, hundreds of applications, and all need potential integrations. And the flavors of integrations, you may have some that are still using mainframe type systems, some using, there may be SaaS-based systems. Once you're dealing with SaaS-based systems, some you may have created, some the vendor may created in support. So having it centrally located, using the old-fashioned, I'll date myself with this, the old run book of this integration goes down, what do you need to do? Just restart it? Do you need to do a restore? Just understanding all of them at that kind of level and pulling that into a central function is already a step in the right direction, because now you can corral it versus once it's dispersed throughout your organization, there's one here, one there, one everywhere, it's a lot more difficult. But if you can get your arms around it, you can now strategize and figure out the best way forward, because ultimately there will be a path you're going to want to take, and you already have the expertise in that center of excellence.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark, you know, I think Lindsay also, I'm just sort of looking at the chat here, and Lindsay made a great a point here, and that there are two challenges that are running parallel in the industry. It's not only grappling with the strategy, you know, at the upper level, but then how schools and universities are going to use that strategy to meet their goals. You know, I think it's an important point. And she also made, I think, a point earlier, is that if higher education can unify itself as a customer, wouldn't it be, you know, wouldn't that be a way to drive these standards in a way that's also more efficient for the vendor, as opposed to the vendor driving the strategies down to higher education?
Yeah, I think that brings up another set of deep discussions I don't think we're getting into just yet, other than I'll make the flip comment that has been rolling around for a while. And because higher ed does get together in a centralized way, very well connected, talks about a lot of things, but the idea is higher ed loves standards because there's an opportunity to create so many of them.